There is a moment in the history of warfare when a single secret becomes worth more than an entire army, not because of what that secret destroys outright, but because of what it quietly unmakes, decision by decision, sortie by sortie, over months and years, invisible to the enemy being undone. This is the story of one of those secrets, a secret so valuable, so carefully guarded, that the men who held it were forced to watch American sailors die rather than reveal what they knew. It is the story of a machine the Japanese believed was unbreakable, the Americans who proved otherwise, and a morning over the Solomon Islands when those two facts collided at 30,000 feet with consequences that echoed all the way to Tokyo. The date is April 18, 1943. The place is a stretch of open sky above the jungle coast of Bougainville Island, in what is now Papua New Guinea. 16 American P-38 Lightning fighter aircraft are climbing hard, flying a carefully calculated intercept course, their pilots under orders so strict and so unusual that several of them have been told nothing about why they are there or why the timing matters so absolutely. They know only that they are hunting something important. What they do not know, well, almost no one on the American side yet knows, is that the man they are about to kill is the single most important military figure in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and that his death has been arranged not by luck, not by aggressive patrolling, but by the patient, grinding, invisible labor of mathematicians and linguists working in a basement in Washington. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story begins not in the Pacific and not with fighter plane, but in a government office building in Tokyo in the late 1930s, where a group of Japanese Navy cryptographers were developing what they believed to be an impenetrable system for encoding diplomatic and military communications. The machine at the heart of this system was an electromechanical cipher device using a series of telephone-style stepping switches to scramble outgoing text into a stream of seemingly random characters. The Japanese called their high-level diplomatic cipher system Engoki Taipubi, Type B cipher machine. American code breakers, when they first began encountering its encrypted output, gave it a different name. They called it Purple. To understand why the breaking of Purple mattered so profoundly, and why it would eventually lead a Japanese admiral to a fatal appointment in the skies above Bougainville, it is necessary to understand what the machine was and what was not. Japan had developed Purple specifically for its most sensitive communications, particularly those passing between Tokyo and its overseas embassies and consulates. The system used two sets of switches, a group of 6 letters processed through one set, and the remaining 20 letters of the alphabet processed through a separate, more complex stepping switch arrangement. The resulting output was formidably difficult to crack by hand. Without knowing the day's key settings, the specific configuration of the machine on any given date, an intercepted Purple message was effectively meaningless noise. The Japanese cryptographers were, by any reasonable measure, right to feel confident. Their machine was theoretically secure. The problem was not the machine. The problem was the humans using it. The American effort to penetrate Purple began in earnest in the summer of 1939, led by a civilian mathematician and cryptanalyst named William Friedman at the Army's Signal Intelligence Service in Washington. Friedman had spent years building one of the most skilled code-breaking teams in the world, drawing on mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle solvers who, in another era, might have spent their careers in university lecture halls. The task they faced with Purple was unlike anything they had previously attempted. They had no capture machine. They had no defectors. They had only the encrypted traffic itself. Thousands of intercepted messages, all of them meaningless until the underlying system could be reconstructed purely through mathematical analysis. What followed was one of the most demanding intellectual achievements of the Second World War. Working without a blueprint, without any physical access to the original device, Friedman's team spent 18 months studying the patterns in Purple's output, the subtle statistical regularities that no cipher, however sophisticated, can entirely conceal. The work nearly broke Friedman himself. He suffered a serious mental breakdown in 1941, partly attributed to the crushing pressure of the project, and spent time hospitalized. But by September of 1940, his team had succeeded. They had reverse-engineered the Purple machine, not by capturing one, but by deducing its internal wiring from mathematics alone. They built their own working analog from commercial telephone switches, and they began to read Japan's most protected communications. The Americans named their intelligence product derived from Purple Decrypt's magic. It was an apt choice of word, because what magic delivered was, from a military intelligence standpoint, very nearly miraculous. Japan's diplomatic communications in the months before Pearl Harbor flowed through magic intercepts to American desks in near real time. Warnings of escalating tension, of Tokyo's hardening resolve, of deadlines being set and ultimatums being contemplated. All of it was visible to those clear for magic. The tragedy of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, is inseparable from the history of magic, though not in the way popular mythology often suggests. The attack was not invisible to American intelligence. What failed was not the intelligence itself, but the ability to correctly interpret and act upon it. A failure of analysis and distribution, not of cryptanalysis. But Pearl Harbor is not the center of this story. Pearl Harbor is, in a sense, the prelude, because after December 7th, the question that magic raised was no longer whether Japan intended war. The question was how to win it, and how to win it in such a way that the Japanese never realized their most important communication system had been compromised. This was the knife's edge on which every decision involving magic intelligence had to be made. The secret of Purple's breaking was itself a weapon, one that could only be used with extraordinary care. Use it too openly, act on it too directly, too obviously, and Tokyo would realize that someone was reading their mail. The machine would be changed, the settings revised, the traffic would go dark, and magic would die. Every magic-derived operation, therefore, required a plausible cover story. Every advantage had to be disguised as luck, as aggressive patrolling, as coincidence. Nowhere was this tension more acute than in the Pacific Naval War of 1942 and 1943. After catastrophic losses at Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy had rebuilt around its surviving carrier forces and was fighting a brutal war of attrition across thousands of miles of open ocean and contested island chains. The campaign for Guadalcanal, which raged from August 1942 through February 1943, was not merely a ground and air battle over a piece of jungle-covered real estate. It was a contest to control the entire Lower Solomon Islands chain, a strategic pressure point that both sides recognized as essential to the direction of the wider Pacific War. American forces took Guadalcanal's airfield, renamed Henderson Field, and held it through months of Japanese air, naval, and ground attack. The cost on both sides was enormous. It was during this period that a second layer of intelligence success, running parallel to magic's diplomatic product, became critical. American naval cryptanalysts, working at a unit in Pearl Harbor known as Station HYPO, under the direction of Commander Joseph Rockefort, had been making significant inroads into a different Japanese cipher system. The Imperial Japanese Navy's operational code, known to American analysts as JN-25. Unlike Purple, which was a machine cipher used for diplomatic traffic, JN-25 was a book code combined with additive ciphers, a more traditional but enormously complex system through which the Japanese Navy coordinated its operational movements. Breaking JN-25 was never a clean, total success the way Purple was. The Japanese changed the code regularly, and at any given time American analysts might be reading anywhere from a small fraction to a more substantial portion of intercepted traffic. But even partial reading of operational Japanese naval communications, combined with traffic analysis, the study of who was communicated with whom and when and with what priority, gave American intelligence a considerable window into Japanese naval movements. It was through a combination of JN-25 operational intercepts and traffic analysis that American intelligence in April 1943 received information that would set in motion the events of April 18th. The Japanese had been making a concerted effort to boost morale in the Solomon Islands garrison areas. Their naval commander-in-chief, Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had conceived and personally organized an extended air offensive designated Operation Igo, launched in early April 1943. The operation sent waves of carrier-based and land-based Japanese aircraft against American positions, shipping in Henderson Field. Yamamoto, who kept meticulous records and ran his command with unusual personal attention to detail, had declared the operation a notable success. Claims the staff received with more enthusiasm than the actual results justified, since American losses were considerably smaller than Japanese after-action assessments suggested. Following Operation Igo, Yamamoto planned a personal inspection tour of forward Japanese base areas in the northern Solomons and in the area of Bougainville, intended to boost the morale of garrison troops and flying personnel. On April 13, 1943, a message encoded in JN-25 and transmitted through Japanese naval channels laid out Yamamoto's complete itinerary for April 18th, his departure time, the route, the precise schedule of each stop, the types of aircraft that would carry him and provide his fighter escort. The message was intercepted by American signals intelligence stations, processed and decoded. By April 14, its contents had been conveyed to Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of Pacific Fleet, at Pearl Harbor. What Nimitz now held in his hands was both an extraordinary gift and an agonizing dilemma. The message told him exactly where Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man whose strategic vision had made the Imperial Japanese Navy what it was, would be, at exactly what time, fly in a known aircraft type on a known route, on a specific morning 4 days away. The range from American-controlled Henderson Field on Guadalcanal to the intercept point near Bougainville was approximately 430 miles each way, beyond the combat radius of every American fighter aircraft in theater except one. The P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design and twin-Allison engines, had a combat radius that, with careful fuel management and external drop tanks, could just barely reach the intercept point. Just barely. Nimitz's problem was not tactical. The P-38s could make the flight. The intercept geometry was calculable. The timing could be coordinated. His problem was strategic, and it was the same problem that had haunted every magic decision since 1940. If Yamamoto's plane was shot down on this particular morning, the Japanese would want to know why. They would investigate. They would look at who knew about the tour, how the information might have leaked, whether their communications had been compromised. If they concluded, even suspected, that JN-25 traffic was being read, they would change the system. They would tighten their procedures. Magic and the associated naval codebreaking would go dark at exactly the moment American forces were beginning to use it most effectively. Potentially thousands of American lives, the success of future operations, the pace of the entire Pacific War, all of it could be placed at risk in exchange for killing one man, however important. Nimitz consulted Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, and ultimately with Fleet Admiral Ernest King. The decision was made to proceed. The reasoning, reduced to its essentials, was this. Yamamoto was not simply a capable military commander. He was, within the Imperial Japanese Navy, effectively irreplaceable. He combined strategic vision, institutional authority, the personal loyalty of his subordinates, and international reputation in a way that no obvious successor could replicate. His death would do more than remove one admiral from the order of battle. It would remove the animating intelligence of the Japanese Pacific naval strategy at a moment of increasing pressure. And a cover story could be constructed. American patrol activity in the area could be cited. A tip from coast watchers. The Allied agents hidden on Japanese-held islands throughout the Solomons could be suggested as a source. The operation would be deniable. The 16 P-38s assigned to the mission were drawn from the 339th Fighter Squadron, based at Henderson Field. Their commander, Major John Mitchell, was given the task of planning the intercept. Mitchell worked the navigation problem with care that bordered on obsession. The flight to the intercept point would be made at low altitude, below Japanese radar, on a course designed to avoid Japanese-held islands, where observers might report unusual American air activity. The route added significant distance to an already extreme-range mission. Mitchell calculated the timing down to the minute. The intercept had to occur precisely as Yamamoto's aircraft, a Mitsubishi G4M twin-engine medium bomber, known to American pilots by the nickname Betty, was approaching its destination. Not before, not after. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 18 pilots were originally briefed for the mission, but 2 were unable to fly due to mechanical problems with their aircraft, bringing the group to 16. Mitchell would lead the main escort of 12, tasked with drawing off or engaging Yamamoto's Zero fighter escort. The kill flight, the 4 P-38s whose specific task was to close directly on Yamamoto's transport aircraft, was led by Captain Thomas Lanford, Jr., with Lieutenant Rex Barber, Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and Lieutenant Raymond Hine. The four men took off on the morning of April 18th, knowing they were going after a high-value target. Most did not yet know the target's name. The flight out was flown at 50 feet above the water, low enough that the pilots could see the wave tops clearly beneath them, low enough to stay beneath Japanese radar coverage, low enough to make navigation a matter of intense concentration across open ocean. Mitchell navigated by compass and dead reckoning for nearly 2 hours, making the turns at prescribed waypoints, maintaining the schedule that the intercept calculation demanded. When the P-38s reached the coast of Bougainville and began their climb, they were exactly on time, almost to the second. At 35 minutes past 9 on the morning of April 18, 1943, the lookout aircraft at the front of Mitchell's climbing formation spotted two dark shapes emerging from a tree above the Bougainville coast. Two Mitsubishi G-4M bombers, fly in loose formation, with 6 Zero fighters arranged as escorts above and behind them. The geometry of the intercept was, by any measure, almost impossibly precise. After a low-level ocean crossing of more than 400 miles, after nearly 2 hours of dead reckoning navigation over open water with no landmarks and no radio guidance, John Mitchell's 16 P-38s had arrived at the kill zone within seconds of the scheduled intercept time. It was, by the standards of any air operation in the Second World War, a navigational achievement of the first order. What followed in the next 4 minutes was violent, confused, and has been disputed in its precise details ever since. The kill flight of 4 P-38s dropped their external fuel tanks and pushed their throttles forward. The 12 escort P-38s went for the Zeros. The two bombers, caught in a moment of complete surprise, broke in different directions. One turned toward the coast, descending toward the jungle canopy. The other turned out over the water. In the chaos of closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, with Zeros now turning hard to engage, the kill flight split. Rex Barber closed on the bomber heading for the jungle, pressing his attack through return fire from the Betty's tail gunner, firing long bursts from his nose-mounted 20mm cannon and 450 caliber machine guns. Thomas Lanford, in the same seconds, turned to engage a Zero and then, according to his account, turned back and fired on the jungle-bound bomber as well. The first bomber, the one headed for the jungle, went down in the trees near the coast of Bougainville, trailing fire and did not emerge. The second bomber, the one that had turned out over the water, was hit by Barber on a second pass and crashed into the sea. Lieutenant Raymond Hine, one of the four in the kill flight, did not return to Henderson Field. He was listed as missing in action and was never found. Of the 12 P-38s in the escort flight, one other was damaged. The operation had, by any military accounting, succeeded. The question of who actually fired the shots that brought down the first bomber, the aircraft that, as would later be confirmed, carried Admiral Yamamoto, became one of the most persistent and bitter controversies in American aviation history. Thomas Lanford claimed the kill for himself from the moment he landed at Henderson Field. Rex Barber claimed it too, insisting that his attack had been the decisive one. Both men pursued their competing claims for decades after the war, through veterans organizations, through letters, through congressional hearings, through memoirs. The dispute was never resolved to everyone's satisfaction. In 1947, the Army Air Forces credited both men with half a kill each, a compromise that satisfied neither. The historical weight of subsequent analysis, including post-war examination of Japanese records and the physical evidence on the crash site, has tended to favor Barber's account, or at minimum to cast serious doubt on Lanford's more dramatic version of events. But the truth, like Raymond Hine, has never quite been found. On the jungle floor of Bougainville, a Japanese search party located the wreckage of the first bomber the following morning, April 19th. They found Yamamoto's body still strapped in his seat, which had been thrown clear of the aircraft by the force of the impact. He was dressed in his formal uniform. He had been killed by gunfire, not by the crash itself. 2 bullet wounds, one through his left shoulder and one through his jaw. He was holding his ceremonial sword. A Japanese Navy surgeon who examined the body later wrote that despite the violence of the end, Yamamoto's expression was composed, or perhaps simply past composure. He was 59 years old. The Japanese Navy did not immediately announce Yamamoto's death. The news was kept secret for more than 5 weeks, while Tokyo worked through political and psychological implications of what it meant to tell the Japanese people that their most celebrated naval commander, the man who had struck Pearl Harbor, was gone. The official announcement came on May 21st, 1943. It was accompanied by a state funeral of extraordinary ceremony. Yamamoto was posthumously promoted to Fleet Admiral, the highest rank in the Imperial Japanese Navy. His ashes were divided, half interred at Tama Cemetery in Tokyo, half at his hometown of Nagaoka in Niigata Prefecture. Emperor Hirohito issued a personal rescript of mourning. In the United States, the news broke through a combination of official announcement and increasingly poorly controlled rumor. American newspapers ran the story with varying degrees of detail. Some mentioned the role of intelligence. Some mentioned the P-38s. The question of how American forces had known exactly where to find Yamamoto on that particular morning was, for anyone paying attention, conspicuous by its absence from official accounts. The cover story, aggressive patrolling, Coast Watcher tips, was maintained in public. Behind the scenes, the intelligence community held its breath. Tokyo investigated. Of course they investigated. The loss of the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet in an ambush of such surgical precision was not something that a competent military organization could attribute to coincidence without scrutiny. Japanese naval investigators examined the possibility that communications had been compromised. They reviewed the procedure surrounding the transmission of Yamamoto's itinerary message. They looked at who had access to the information, whether the message had reached unintended recipients, whether there had been any observable increase in American patrol activity that might have suggested advanced knowledge. Their conclusion, ultimately, was that the most likely explanation was a leak from human sources, a Coast Watcher network, a compromised individual somewhere in the chain of knowledge about Yamamoto's movements. The possibility that JN-25 itself had been broken was considered and, ultimately, not acted upon with the urgency that might have closed the window permanently. This was, from the American perspective, the most important outcome of the entire operation, not the death of Yamamoto, though that was significant. The most important outcome was that Japan did not change its naval communication system in any fundamental way in response. JN-25 continued to be used. The American ability to read portions of Japanese naval traffic, never total, always partial, always contested, survived the operation intact. The window stayed open. Why? The reasons are several, and together they illuminate something important about the limits of even excellent military intelligence when it operates inside a large bureaucratic organization. First, the Japanese had changed JN-25 in May 1942, just before the Battle of Midway, a change that temporarily blinded American codebreakers at a critical moment, though the analysts recovered enough of the new system in time to read the essential Midway operational traffic. Having changed the code once at great organizational cost, with all the disruption that redistributing new code books across a scattered Pacific theater entailed, Japanese naval authorities were understandably reluctant to do so again without overwhelming evidence of compromise. Second, the alternative explanation, a human leak, was psychologically and institutionally easier for the Japanese Navy to absorb. A leak could be investigated, plugged, punished. Admitting that the Cipher system itself had been broken was a more fundamental failure, one that implicated the organization's core competence in a way that human error did not. Third, and perhaps most tellingly, there is a question of confirmation bias, the tendency of any intelligence organization and any human being to interpret ambiguous evidence in the light most favorable to existing assumptions. The Japanese cryptographers had designed Purple and their naval codes with considerable sophistication. They had not seen any direct evidence of their communications being read. No American forces appearing exactly where a message had said they would be. No operations compromised in ways that pointed unmistakably to signals intelligence rather than other sources. The Yamamoto intercept was, in retrospect, almost too perfect an operation to avoid raising suspicion. But the cover story provided just enough alternative explanation to allow the more comfortable interpretation to prevail. The continued security of Magic and the associated naval code-breaking after the Yamamoto operation was not an accident. It was a product of extraordinary discipline maintained over years by the American intelligence and military community. The number of people cleared for magic intelligence was, throughout the war, kept deliberately small. Operational planners who needed to act on magic-derived intelligence were told what they needed to know, not how it was known. Cover stories were constructed, maintained, and repeated. Coast Watcher reports were given prominent attribution. Aggressive patrol schedules were maintained along routes where American forces had no intelligence-derived reason to be, precisely so that the routes where they did have such reasons would not stand out. The discipline required was a kind that runs against a natural human impulse to explain a success or to share remarkable knowledge. It held, for the most part, throughout the war. The question of Yamamoto's actual strategic significance, whether his death meaningfully changed the course of the Pacific War, is one that historians have debated with considerable nuance ever since. The case for his importance is, on the surface, strong. He was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, executed over his own initial reservations about a war with the United States that he had argued Japan could not win in the long run. He had designed and commanded the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, overseen the early successes of Japanese naval power projection across the Pacific, and retained the confidence of subordinates and of the naval establishment in a way that transcended ordinary command loyalty. His successor, Admiral Menaichi Koga, was a competent officer but lacked Yamamoto's force of personality and a particular combination of strategic ambition and tactical boldness. And yet the honest assessment of Yamamoto's death requires acknowledging what it did not change. By April 1943, the strategic momentum in the Pacific had already shifted decisively against Japan. The Battle of Midway, 11 months earlier in June 1942, had cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable trained air groups, a loss from which Japanese naval aviation never recovered. The Guadalcanal campaign, concluded in February 1943, had ground down Japanese naval and air strength in the Solomons in a war of attrition that Japan's industrial base, dramatically outpaced by American production, could not sustain. The factories of Detroit and the shipyards of the American coastlines were building warships, aircraft, and supplies at rates that had no parallel in Japanese industry. By the spring of 1943, American Essex-class fleet carriers were beginning to enter service, each one displacing more than 27,000 tons, each one carrying more than 90 aircraft. Japan was producing capable individual machines and courageous individual fighting men, but the aggregate balance was already beyond recovery. What Yamamoto's death represented in this context was not the turning point of the Pacific War. That turning point had already passed, but rather a symbol of the turning point, a moment of clarity about what the intelligence advantage represented by magic actually meant in practice. Magic did not win the Pacific War. American industrial output, American logistical capacity, American shipbuilding, American pilot training programs, and American fighting determination won the Pacific War. What magic did, what it represented at its best, in operations like the Yamamoto Intercept and the intelligence preparation for Midway, was allow the United States to win it more efficiently, to apply force at the right moments, to deny Japan the recovery time that might, in some circumstances, have prolonged the conflict by months or years. The men who built the magic capability understood this. William Friedman, the mathematician whose team had broken purple, spent the war in quiet exhaustion, suffering recurring mental health crises brought on partly by the pressure work that he could not discuss with anyone outside his small cleared circle. He received the Medal of Merit in 1946, in a ceremony that was not public. His contribution to the war effort was not widely known for decades. Joseph Rockefort, whose station HYPO at Pearl Harbor had read the JN-25 traffic that made Midway possible, was removed from his post in late 1942 in an inter-service political dispute and never commanded a code-breaking operation again, despite the quality of his work. He received the Distinguished Service Medal, but not until 1986, 30 years after his retirement and 3 years after his death in 1976. Congress passed a resolution that same year acknowledging his contribution. The P-38 pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron received their recognition rather more quickly. Thomas Lanphier and Rex Barber were each awarded the Navy Cross. John Mitchell received a Navy Cross as well, a remarkable distinction for an Army Air Forces officer, reflecting the joint nature of the operation. They returned to combat. The Pacific War ground on for another 2 years and 4 months after the morning of April 18, 1943, through Tarawa and Saipan, and Leyte Gulf and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, consuming lives in numbers that still resist easy comprehension. The secret of how Yamamoto had been found was not publicly confirmed until after the war's end. There's one final irony embedded in this story, the kind of irony that history seems to reserve for those moments when human ingenuity and human hubris collide most directly. Isoroku Yamamoto had spent much of his adult professional life warning the Japanese military and political leadership against the precise outcome that unfolded. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity with an intimacy that few of his colleagues shared. When Prime Minister Tojo and the Naval General Staff concluded that war with the United States was unavoidable, Yamamoto had argued against it, not out of cowardice, but out of strategic realism. He had famously written, in a letter before Pearl Harbor, that even a successful first strike would not be enough, that Japan could run wild for 6 months or a year, but that after that there was no prospect of success. His letter has been quoted often enough that its specificity has sometimes been blurred, but the underlying judgment was sound and he knew it. He planned Pearl Harbor because, having argued against the war and lost the argument, he concluded that if war was coming regardless, Japan's only chance was a decisive blow at the outset. He aimed for 6 carriers at Pearl Harbor and got battleships instead. The American carriers were at sea that Sunday morning. He suffered the loss of 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, a battle shaped in part by the intelligence advantage created by the very kind of code-breaking operation his own Navy had failed to protect. He launched Operation Igo from the Rabaul area in early April 1943 and declared a success that his subordinates inflated and that the American side barely registered. He planned an inspection tour to boost the morale of men fighting a war he had privately believed from the beginning could not be won. And he transmitted the details of that tour in a cipher that had been broken by men working in a building in Washington, using commercial telephone switches and mathematical analysis, 3 years before he climbed into that Betty bomber for the last time. The cipher machine the Japanese called Type B, the machine the Americans called Purple, the intelligence it produced that the Americans called Magic. None of these things are household names. They live in the specialized literature of cryptographic history, in the testimony of men who spent their working lives in silence about things they had done. The magic intercepts themselves were not declassified until the 1970s. The full story of what they meant took decades longer to assemble, but the chain of consequence they represent, from a mathematical breakthrough in a Washington basement in 1940 to 16 P-38s above Bougainville in 1943, to the strategic balance of the Pacific War, is as direct and as consequential as any single thread in the vast tapestry of the Second World War. The morning of April 18, 1943, lasted 4 minutes for the men who flew it. It lasted a lifetime for the ones who came home. And it has lasted in one form or another for as long as there have been people willing to ask how the world's most powerful navy came to lose its most important admiral to an ambush arranged not by luck, not by bravery alone, though there was bravery in abundance, but by the quiet, unglamorous, essential work of people who sat in rooms and read other people's mail, and who understood, better than most, what knowledge is truly worth when the stakes are high enough. Here is an expanded final section, approximately 700 additional words to replace everything from the paragraph beginning. There is one final irony, onward. Drop this in place of that section, and the closing paragraphs. There is one final irony embedded in this story, the kind of irony that history seems to reserve for those moments when human ingenuity and human hubris collide most directly. Isoroku Yamamoto had spent much of his adult professional life warning the Japanese military and political leadership against the precise outcome that unfolded. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity with an intimacy that few of his colleagues shared. When Prime Minister Tojo and the Naval General Staff concluded that war with the United States was unavoidable, Yamamoto had argued against it, not out of cowardice, but out of strategic realism. He had famously written, in a letter before Pearl Harbor, that even a successful first strike would not be enough, that Japan could run wild for 6 months or a year, but that after that there was no prospect of success. His letter has been quoted often enough that its specificity has sometimes been blurred, but the underlying judgment was sound, and he knew it. He planned Pearl Harbor because, having argued against the war and lost the argument, he concluded that if war was coming regardless, Japan's only chance was a decisive blow at the outset. He aimed for 6 carriers at Pearl Harbor and got battleships instead. The American carriers were at sea that Sunday morning. He suffered the loss of 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, a battle shaped in part by the intelligence advantage created by the very kind of code-breaking operation his own Navy had failed to protect. He launched Operation Igo from the Rabaul area in early April 1943 and declared a success that his subordinates inflated and that the American side barely registered. He planned an inspection tour to boost the morale of men fighting a war he had privately believed from the beginning could not be won. And he transmitted the details of that tour in a cipher that had been broken by men working in a building in Washington, using commercial telephone switches and mathematical analysis, 3 years before he climbed into that Betty bomber for the last time. What makes this irony cut so deeply is not simply that Yamamoto was killed by intelligence he helped create the conditions for by going to war, by authorizing the communication structure that became Magic's feeding ground. What makes it cut deeply is the particular nature of the man himself. He was not an ideologue. He did not believe in the mythology of Japanese racial destiny or the inevitability of a Pacific empire the way some of his contemporaries did. He believed in the Navy, in his men, in seamanship, in the application of calculated force. He played poker during his time in the United States, seriously, skillfully, for real money, and he understood the game's central lesson, that knowing the odds does not guarantee the outcome, but ignoring them guarantees ruin. He had read the odds correctly about the war with America and been overruled. He had then done his duty with the professionalism that his character demanded, and it had led him, by the most logical sequence of steps imaginable, to a jungle on Bougainville at 35 minutes past 9 on a Tuesday morning in April. The man who broke purple never met him. William Friedman, recovering in a hospital from the mental collapse that the effort had cost him, had no way of knowing that the machine he had unmade with mathematics would one day direct P-38s to an island most Americans could not have found on a map. The Navy cryptanalyst at station HYPO, reading fragments of JN-25 traffic through the static in the gaps and the partial recoveries, were not thinking about one Admiral's inspection schedule. They were thinking about the next intercept, the next partial decode, the next small increment of clarity out of noise. That is the nature of intelligence work at its most essential. It is incremental, relentless, and almost entirely invisible until a moment it becomes undeniable. And that invisibility is, perhaps, the most important thing to carry away from this story. Wars in the popular imagination are fought with steel and fire, with charges across open ground and bombers darkening the sky. Those things happen. The courage they require was real, and it deserves every tribute it has ever been given. But running alongside that visible war, in every major conflict of the modern era, there's a parallel war of information, of encoding and decoding, of pattern recognition and patient analysis, of building and breaking the systems through which human beings try to speak to one another without being overheard. That war is fought by people who receive no parades. It is won by people whose names appear, if they appear at all, in footnotes that are themselves classified for decades. Its victories look, from the outside, like luck. The Cipher machine the Japanese call Type B, the machine the Americans call Purple, the intelligence it produced that the Americans call Magic, none of these things are household names. They live in the specialized literature of cryptographic history, in the testimony of men who spent their working lives in silence about things they had done. The Magic intercepts themselves were not declassified until the 1970s. The full story of what they meant took decades longer to assemble. But the chain of consequence they represent, from a mathematical breakthrough in a Washington basement in 1940, to 16 P-38s above Bougainville in 1943, to the strategic balance of the Pacific War, is as direct and as consequential as any single thread in the vast tapestry of the Second World War. The morning of April 18, 1943, lasted 4 minutes for the men who flew it. It lasted a lifetime for the ones who came home. And somewhere in a country that had not yet begun to lose a war it had already lost, a staff officer read a decoded message about an inspection tour, clear it through proper channels, and transmitted it in a cipher he had every reason to believe was unbreakable. He was doing his job. He was following procedure. He had no way of knowing that the machine humming at the other end of the circuit had already been taken apart and reassembled, piece by invisible piece, by men who never fired a shot and never would. And that in that reassembly, the fate of a fleet admiral and something the fate of a war had already been quietly, irrevocably decided. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.